Of all the anime franchises that have sprouted up recently, the one that I've wanted to succeed the most and has most consistently disappointed me is Garo. Garo is a transforming hero series based on the tokusatsu franchise of the same name, and it features some really cool plot premises and eye-catching designs. I grew up on the early generations of Power Rangers, and my love for the transforming hero genre really hasn't wavered all that much since then, so Garo is pretty much right up my alley. The first season was mostly solid with a strong duo of protagonists and retro art design. Unfortunately, it completely dropped the ball in the last 6 episodes and turned into a hot mess of generic anime bullshit. As for the second series, Crimson Moon, I think this sums up my feelings rather nicely. Which brings us to the most recent installment of the Garo anime, Vanishing Line. This season has a decisively more modern take on what has typically been a historical fantasy series, but it definitely has enough style and personality to back up such a drastic change. Hell, I was pretty much sold as soon as this scene happened.
Ooh.
Nani?
感謝だよ.
It's not hugely unique or stand out in its ideas, but the aesthetics of the series resonated with me in a way that I didn't expect since I'm not typically into this kind of style. However, there's just one tiny problem with this series that keeps me from enjoying it. You see, this action series has some of the worst action animation from any anime I've ever seen. It's almost impossible to put into words how much of a giant clusterfuck these action scenes are, and having each episode end on this incomprehensible nonsense made me less and less likely to continue the series the more I watched it. But how exactly did Garo's action become so horrible? What is it in a cinematic manner that makes an action scene bad? For me, the most obvious distinction between a good action scene and a bad one is clarity, i.e. being able to see what is actually happening. There are a lot of ways to create clarity in a fight scene, but in general, the 3 most important elements are lighting, space, and speed. When I say that lighting is important, I don't mean that creating fight scenes in dark areas is automatically bad. That would remove some of the greatest fights in anime history. Rather, it's the contrast of lighting, and as a result, contrast of color, that's important. If all the colors are really close to each other in shade, hue, and saturation, then the lines that differentiate one body from another become less and less obvious, thus making it more difficult to see what's actually happening. To counteract this, including drastic lighting shifts or brief flashes of more intense colors makes it easier to distinguish what's going on, something that a show like Darker Than Black, or basically any other Bones action series, excels at. In truth, this point actually came to me because I finally began my rewatch of Neon Genesis Evangelion, and though it's hardly the most exhilarating or high-octane action fight, the final showdown with the angel Ramiel is a great example of what I'm talking about. Despite the relatively dark colors of the backgrounds and combatants, the bright lights emitted by each fighter's attacks, as well as the explosion that results from Ramiel's defeat, makes the action easy to read and understand. It's also just not a great idea in general to have a scene that's supposed to be intense and exciting be made up of mostly the same colors. Contrast is an important aspect of any cinematic presentation, but it's especially important in action scenes for there to be some kind of contrasting dynamic for viewers to latch onto, even if it isn't thematically resonant with the narrative. Next is spacing. The actual geographic composition of a battle and being adept at creating a readable space go a long way in selling an action scene, but Garo's problems begin before we can even get to that point. Most of the action scenes in this series fill up the entirety of the area that the camera can observe and overflow into non-existent space. Put simply, everything's too fucking close to the camera so we can't tell what we're even looking at. It's like if I zoomed in on this shot of an elephant so much that you could barely tell it's an elephant. Also, this isn't even an elephant. Now imagine that to apply to the monsters in Garo, enemies that have strange, semi-amorphous shapes that are hard to categorize, and the problem becomes even more severe. I'm sure that sometimes you really want to get in close and see the gruesome details of the enemies, even if the CG is terrible, but giving all of the fighters room to breathe and move around effectively is much more important. The empty space surrounding the fight is just as crucial as the space that's currently being occupied, because it creates the illusion that the fight is happening happening in a real space rather than just a flat 16:9 area. Again, I have to fall back on Bones for a great example of this with what is arguably the greatest technical display of fight animation in anime, Sword of the Stranger. This fight isn't just impressive because it has a lot of cool Sakuga moments or because they swing their swords really fast. It's impressive because Yutaka Nakamura made full use of the entire environment that this fight takes place in, and because he's able to animate each section of that environment from interesting angles and distances. Yes, there are close-up shots in this fight, but they only make up a few portions of a much larger composition. Close-ups, mediums, wides, all of these are essential for creating a readable fight scene because it allows the viewer an opportunity to orient themselves as to where everything is happening within a given location. This idea also feeds back into the idea of contrast mentioned earlier. If you have the same kind of shot over and over again, it becomes boring and unclear as to what's actually happening. But by creating contrast within each scene, it not only makes the fight more dynamic and more exciting as a result, but it also allows the viewer to get a stronger grasp of what's actually happening in each part of the set. Lastly, there's speed, which, surprisingly, I rarely find to be much of a problem in even the worst action scenes, and yet has manifested in folds in Garo. In this instance, though, it really just boils down to one simple fault. The camera is moving way too fast. Quick camera work is fine to a certain extent and in controlled bursts, but in Garo not only is the camera moving faster than the eye can keep up with, but it does so for really long periods of time, making it even more difficult to keep track of what's going on. There's also a matter of pacing out this speed as well, again feeding back into the idea of contrast. Garo really likes for everything to be moving all the time during its action scenes, and while you could argue that that's what an action scene would be like in real life, that still doesn't make it fun to watch. Pacing out the fight with anticipation and cooldown shots to create a sense of ebb and flow is just as important as making the fight feel fast and intense. There was a moment in episode 3 where I didn't even know that the main character had delivered the finishing blow to an enemy because the whole fight was just a non-stop barrage of fast movement, and I think that says more about how terribly these fights are constructed than anything else. I really wanted to like this franchise, but it just hasn't given me anything worthwhile lately. While the overall narrative of Vanishing Line wasn't bad, it's not exactly unique or stand out either. And to have an action series be overflowing with terrible action directing is more than enough reason to give up on it entirely. At this point, I'm pretty much done with Garo as a whole. I'll probably check out the movie sequel for the first series at some point since I really liked those characters, and maybe I'll check out the Tokusatsu series, but as of now it looks like the anime franchise has been consigned to permanent mediocrity. Perhaps Garo might have fared better if it had a more direct source material to base itself on, rather than loosely basing itself on a tokusatsu franchise, but as we'll discuss tomorrow, adaptation isn't as simple a process as it might seem. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourke Tinjoin, Christine Seibert, Tim Johnson, Call Me Catlord, Diane Wiersbicki, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.